Hello and welcome to Conversations with the Voice of Reason. I am your host, Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Jeremy Carl, who is a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute and a former assistant to the Secretary of the Interior under the Trump administration. He's been a so-called policy wonk for many years and a graduate of the elite institutions that pump out those who rule the world. And in this conversation, we talk about the actual policy implications of a Trump/Vance administration and what Jeremy Carl, as an insider, believes and wants to happen at the federal level should the administration change from whatever it is now to Trump and Vance. He's also the author of The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart, which is what we spoke about in our first conversation a few months ago. And you can find him via the links below. If you enjoy this content, do like, subscribe, and share. Without further ado, here is Jeremy Carl. A lot has happened since we last spoke.
Yeah, definitely.
And a lot's happening today. I have no idea what the market is, but people are like buzzing about it. I don't know how that's going to affect politics or
The
not.
stock market, you mean, or the
Yeah, the stock market.
oh, yeah. Yeah, well, that is certainly if it crashes, that won't help the oh yeah, wow, it's
The current regime?
yeah, that won't help the current regime, but
Yeah.
yeah, interesting. Well, they'll get a rate cut,
Yeah.
which
Always gonna
Kamala
get a
wants.
recount.
So,
Yeah. So I wanted to speak to you about a more insider view or somebody who's connected to the way
sure.
that our government works. What would
Right.
be a Trump/Vance administration actually look like policy wise? Like
Right.
from your point of view and, to whatever degree you feel comfortable speaking to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, well, major caveat here that I mean, obviously I'm involved in things, but I'm not on the inside of the campaign or the transition or anything like that. So I'm can more speak to my having been a previous senior official in a Trump administration and knowing a lot of folks and certainly knowing a lot of the Vance team and folks like that. I mean, look, I would love to see them kind of fulfill 70% even of what they were trying to do on immigration. I think that's sort of again been the really key thing that Trump has pushed on and got a lot of traction on. He's now got a much more experienced team that he can throw at that. I mean, I think there were a lot of there were a lot of speed bumps and learning curves in 1.0. I think actually, interestingly enough, I've said this both publicly and privately. I think the number one thing that probably determines the success or failure of a second Trump administration is whether or not we have a really, I mean, besides obviously Trump's kind of willingness and energy himself, but whether or not we have an aggressive White House counsel's office and Office of Legal Counsel, like we have to have attorneys who are going to be willing to get out over their skis and issue some very aggressive legal opinions that are going to allow us to do some of the things that we need to do. I think a lot of what you've seen in terms of the lawfare against previous Trump attorneys like my Claremont colleague John Eastman or like Jeffrey Clark, who I did a kind of co-event with in New York City with the book, where these guys are both very high-end attorneys who had worked for Trump and have been the subject of constant lawfare and harassment since, is the left understands that kind of attorneys are really a huge leverage point, and they want to scare away good attorneys from working with the Trump administration. So we need to kind of power through that and have attorneys that are going to be really aggressive and clever in terms of allowing us to essentially work. And I mean, the way that I would simply put this, and this is of course not the way the left will put this in terms of, this is an unconstitutional coup or whatever they'll say. Because ultimately they think that the deep state or the administrative state, the kind of permanent bureaucracy, should really run things. What I would call this entire project is simply restoring democratic accountability to the system. It's the idea that we have a president and the president controls the executive branch, period. And I mean, obviously, they have to operate within the basic rule of law, but these kind of policies and procedures and all these the kind of notion that we can't get rid of bureaucrats, that all has to go away. We have to be able to bring in our people, and this is something that JD Vance has talked about early on. We have to bring in our people. We have to be willing to get rid of their people. By the way, I don't think as much as most of the bureaucracy is against us, I don't think this means like some sort of massive wholesale firing of the bureaucracy, because I think once you show that you're really serious about getting rid of folks who are not doing their job under the Constitution, which is to support the administration, whoever that administration is, once you show you're serious, I think most of these folks will kind of fall in line, at least at some level, because they would like to keep their jobs. And because that is, again, it's in fact the job that they should be doing, even though they don't ever do it when the Republicans run things. So I don't think that this actually has to involve, the wholesale firing of tens of thousands of people or anything like that. I think you need to make a significant but manageable number of examples for the really bad actors, the really bad anti-democratic actors, small d, in the bureaucracy. And I think at that point you'd be able to go forward. But we got to be ready to staff, and we've got to be ready to do all these things.
Is that connected to this 2025 project?
Yeah, so I have a lot of concerns about that, and I've said, on the record, and I went to a couple meetings early on. I ended up not really being involved with it. I never sort of contributed any work products, but I'm at least familiar with what they were doing. I don't know all the details. Clearly, Project 2025 did not manage expectations with the campaign appropriately, but at the same time, I have to look at what happened and how the campaign ultimately treated Project 2025 as an unforced error that was actually really rare, because I think the campaign has been so much more disciplined this time than we've seen in either of the last two efforts. But the reason why the media just seized on it is because Trump talked about it. Like, I think all Trump needed to say was like, this is nonsense. Like, you can look at, we have a Republican platform. This is just something a think tank is doing. If you want to know what I'm going to do when I become president, it's right here. And what the Heritage Foundation is doing doesn't, bear any resemblance to that. And I think if he just said that, I think the left would have kept using it, but I think the Sharks would not have kind of reacted to the chum in the water in the way that they did when we started saying, oh, it's really bad. And the problem is, of course, that they had done a tremendous amount of vetting of personnel and putting out policies. And I think, look, the reality is right now, the Trump administration is disavowing, or the Trump campaign, and that's fine. They need to do what they're going to do. But at the end of the day, they're going to come in and the results of that work, whatever, under whatever name it goes by, is going to have a bunch of the vetted people and and policy ideas that the Trump administration is going to want to run with. So in some form or fashion, a lot of this work and a lot of the personnel stuff, I do think will ultimately get used. But look, I mean, obviously this was a wish list, and
Hmm.
the stuff in there that is, that Trump doesn't like or is not popular, he's not going to do it. I mean, it's just going to be that simple. I mean, Trump is going to run his own administration. And, I think we would have just been much better off if Trump had basically really clearly communicated that from the
Yeah.
beginning. And then we wouldn't have had the level of kind of discussion about this third party project to begin with.
Yeah. What is your opinion on the rhetorical switch from the enemies of Trump, from he's a Nazi dictator Hitler to he's weird?
I think it's really dumb. I mean, I don't think any of this, like, there's so much, like, people like you and me who are, maybe I'm not going to put you in that thing. People like me who are spending every day, like kind of looking, you spend so much time worrying about every stupid news cycle. And I just don't think any of this matters right now.
Okay.
Harris is going to get her bump. She's already gotten a bump, but she's going to get more from the convention. I actually think that the Trump campaign's strategy, such as we're seeing it right now, is actually pretty sound with her, but it's just early on, and so it's going to take a while for it truly to be introduced. I was not one who thought it was necessarily a big mistake that he's like, well, is she black? Is she Indian? Of course, the left, that drives them nuts. But what he's really pointing to more broadly is, I think, the core messages that they are going to go with, which is she's totally inauthentic. She will say whatever she needs to say to any group of people. And that's obviously a big contrast to Trump, who is many things, but inauthentic is not one of them. So I think they'll go with that. They want to go with that she's incompetent. And I think whenever she finally has to open her mouth in unscripted situations, that's going to be um,
Hard to spin.
evident. And I think she's also radical, and they're going with that. And you can debate the level of her radicalism, but certainly as a San Francisco Democrat and an Oakland Democrat, she signed off on all sorts of radical stuff. And I personally think that like she can't, at the end of the day, even though the regime media will try to cover for her left and right, I don't think she'll be able to run away from that record. And if we're just consistent on that message, I think we'll win. But right now there's a lot of chum in the water, and
Yeah.
people are worrying about the news cycle of the day, and I just
Yeah.
like just chill. Like we'll be
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah. Well, I bring that up because there's a lot of, you said chum in the water, but it's very difficult to see what the reality would be on the ground and the difference between a Kamala administration and a Trump administration. And I brought up why they would switch from he's Hitler to he's weird,
Yeah.
underscores like to what degree would he be a so-called dictator, and to what degree would that be in the worst or the best interests of the American
Yeah.
people?
Yeah, well, he won't be. I mean, I would love it if he were much more dictatorial and had those powers, not because I want some grand D, capital D dictator, but just because I think we need an incredibly strong and focused executive to claw back. Again, this is to me this is not just the spin, but it is, I mean, it is the way I would talk about it publicly, but it's not just spin, it's reality. To restore democratic accountability to this system, you need a really energetic, strong executive who is going to do a lot of things that the Dems are going to scream are dictatorial, but are in fact just restoring the constitutional powers over the executive branch that any president should have. I think that'd be great. I just don't think this weird. I mean, the Democrats are so weird. I don't even get this talking point. I just don't think that like again, it's like, is JD Vance, has he been involved, to some degree in some right-wing subcultures in some minimal way? Sure. Um, he's a married middle American guy with like a
Yeah.
happy family, and he's like a normal guy. And I think, and when he gets out on the stump, he also comes across, I think, to me as to a non-biased observer as a pretty normal guy, whether you love him or hate him. And I just think the kind of notion that you're going to turn him and Trump into these weirdos when you've got all these trans people and God knows whatever else on the left, I don't think it's going to work. So I mean,
Yeah.
I'm happy to have them keep that line of
Yeah. Well, is it what's more weird, Obama growing up in Alinsky and reading Saul
yeah.
Alinsky, or JD Vance reading James Burnham's Machiavellians? Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's totally JD, he's a guy with interesting real intellectual interest, which is of course always exciting for folks like me. But at the end of the day, he's a normal, practical guy who's trying to get things done. He's from a normal part of America. I mean, he has a very interesting, obviously, personal bio. And I just think the weird stuff is not going to work. So I hope they keep saying it, because
Hmm.
it's just not the way. I mean, I don't know. Maybe they don't have other better stuff, but
Well, what are your thoughts about the so-called soft coup? About how Biden was unceremoniously replaced,
yeah,
or
yeah,
what was going on there? Because it seems like they were showing
yeah,
just how they were openly showing just how covert the entire
yeah.
process is.
Yeah, I don't think we know, honestly. I mean, I
Yeah.
was even within the regime media, there are a few good journalists, and I was kind of talking with one who's at the New York Times on background, and I was saying, the person who actually tells the real story of how they pushed Biden out, that's a Pulitzer Prize winning story. Because none of the public stuff you should believe at all. I'm not even just talking about the major public thing of um, you know, oh, he did it selfless. I mean, obviously that's not true. But I mean, even the sort of like how the coup or so-called coup might have gone down. I mean, this is all just self-interested information for various participants. I don't believe any of it. I'm fascinated to know what it is, but it is
Yeah.
interesting. I mean, it's for those of your listeners who are familiar with Curtis Yarvin and his cathedral theory. I mean, I think it really was a vindication of that, and that he was essentially pushed out by the New York Times and the media and elites and the bureaucracy. Um, and we've been foisted upon this candidate who nobody voted for, and everybody's just got to pretend that this is like some healthy democratic process. And I don't know, like that's a big stretch to me. But yeah, I mean, I do think it's fair to call it a coup. Of course um, it's a total inversion of democracy. It's spitting in the face of democracy. Now, I'm not like one of these people who obsesses about democracy, so that's not my personal hobby horse. That like, I kind of think, at a baseline, our democracy is kind of pretty fake. Whether or not he would even be good, it's like asking my belief on Santa Claus. I just don't think you have
Yeah.
democracy at this type of scale.
Yeah.
So we have an oligarchy, and it's kind of nauseating to me at a personal level for these obnoxious oligarchs to kind of berate me and my political allies about democracy. But other than that, at that aesthetic level, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
whatever. It just shows how the Democrats work.
Yeah. Well, so that's what does that tell us about how a potential Kamala administration would run? Like, what is the direction? What is that showing us about who she actually serves or is
Yeah.
the vessel
Well,
for?
I think an effective attack line, which is one way of answering your question, and I didn't mention this earlier, is and Vivek Ramaswamy kind of suggested this early on Twitter and got a lot of traction on it. And it's something I certainly believe is you almost say like it doesn't matter who the face is of these. Kamala is just the face, right? Like it's really all being run by these shadowy people behind the curtains. Biden was wonderful for them because he was so relatively incapacitated and unenergetic that those guys could run things completely. Kamala will be a little more energetic, but they're still going to be running the show. I mean, and she just doesn't have the ability or the energy or whatever else to run things. So I think you want to run
She could
against.
just make it more difficult for them with her ego, or
Yeah,
almost.
exactly. I mean, I think you want to run against the whole system if you're us, the whole corrupt system. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think she'd do the will of the kind of the deep state operatives. I think, an appealing thing to me is, and I actually have a piece that I'm working on this is, I mean, I obviously as folks who read my book or articles, I mean, I kind of view anti-white animus as a pretty animating feature of the existing elite, and in particular the Democratic Party. Part of the magic of Joe Biden for them is that he was sort of the friendly, grandfatherly white face that you could put on that. So people pretend it's not going on. Kamala obviously doesn't have that ability. And I also think that more in her bones, I think Joe Biden was just anti-white transactionally. I mean, you can go back and read things that he did in the 1970s on school busing, and it's really hard to believe that, in his heart of hearts, he hated white people. He just, he was willing to do whatever it took to get power. And so if that meant throwing white voters under the bus, he's happy to do it. Whereas I think Kamala will do that more eagerly if she's in office. And again, I kind of welcome that because I think not to be too
Hmm.
Marxian, but heightening the contradictions is a good thing, and heightening the kind of tensions and making people forced to choose what vision of America they want, I think is a very good thing. So Kamala won't be able to hide in the way that Biden did, and I kind of generally think that's good.
It's one of the odd things to me about the Biden administration is with Biden and Kamala and Kareem Jean Pierre. I haven't
Yeah, Green
practiced her name.
Jean-Pierre. Yeah, so they're
None of them, their only job is to speak, and they all speak terribly. It's like the regime or whatever this is wants to
Yeah.
mock us. It's
Yeah.
weird. Like their only job is to speak well, and they cannot do that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, Biden wasn't always so terrible. I mean, he was always dumb. His
Mm,
policies were always bad, but he had a certain glibness in his younger days to sort of defend him. 10%. Kamala, again, you can debate how much you want to message this, and I think probably it shouldn't come as much from Trump, but she was a DEI hire, just like, by the way, her vice president pick, of which she's only considering white men were. So if you go back, and I've actually floated some of these on Twitter. I mean, Biden said he was going to pick a woman. And with all the George Floyd stuff going on at the time, he pretty much was backed into the corner of, I'm going to pick a black woman. And, Kamala was one of the very, very few kind of plausible people who was going to fit that. So the reason why she's not that great is she hasn't had that much competition. That's also why I think that if the regime media is not just able to cover for her 24/7, I think I feel good about our chances because people sort of look at her and be like, she's like, there's nothing there. And
mm,
what little is there we don't like.
yeah.
So,
Hmm.
yeah.
So how dire is this election? Like, just because democratic politics are democratic politics, it's always the end of democracy if you don't vote in the
Yeah.
right direction. But you kind of
Yeah.
gave a hint that if it goes the other way, if it goes to Kamala, that actually there's a silver lining, well, like kind
Yeah.
of a black pilled silver lining, in that it will accelerate the bad parts and
Yeah.
make it more visible.
Yeah. I was literally just having this discussion an hour ago with a friend of mine who's very, very involved in insider politics, but also kind of has similar ideology to me, and we were having this discussion. I mean, I made it clear that like I mean we both are supporting Trump and we're enthusiastic about the idea of Trump winning, but look, I mean, I think you can make a 25% argument, 25% chance argument that it would actually be better for the right if Kamala won because she will just sort of accelerate these trends and force people to make choices, whereas Trump is kind of he releases that pressure valve, to a degree.
Hmm.
Um, and if he can release the pressure valve and actually get policy wins, then that's great. But if he releases the pressure valve and the underlying situation doesn't really change,
Yeah.
then that's not as great.
Yeah.
So, I think there are worlds in which, even though obviously I do not want Harris to win, it might wind up from a movement perspective that it would be better if she did. And that's just the inherent unpredictability of politics. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm gonna work for the person who I think would do the best job, and that's obviously Trump.
Yeah.
But that's not to say that it's necessarily better for the long-term issue if it's Trump rather than Harris.
Okay. So you brought up immigration, and you brought up, what would it be called? Executive reform as two of the main
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
driving policies?
the administrative state is what I mean. If
Okay.
you're being polite, you would say the reform of the administrative state.
Yeah. And you think that that is possible under a second Trump term?
This is where you need the aggressive people in legal counsel, right? Because
Okay.
we actually did, even at the end of the first Trump administration, that we floated this thing called Schedule F that would effectively allow us to fire a lot of the top bureaucrats if we'd wanted to. And this can get litigated, but at the end of the day, like we need to just say, okay, look, we're putting these, you're just out. We're deactivating your ID card. You no longer have a job, and that's fine. You can go litigate it all you want with us, and we're gonna, tie it up in litigation, and or we're gonna find ways to, if some leftist judge tries to make us, hire you back, we're gonna figure out ways to kind of get around that. And you have to create facts on the ground to me.
Hmm.
So the question is, to do that, you have to have a legal strategy that's plausible. Again, I'm not just saying you can't just have people in there making stuff up, but there are credible attorneys who have offered strategies for how we could accomplish things like this that would pass a reasonable view of constitutional muster. And we need to
Hmm.
have the sorts of guys in the building.
And so your I guess your theory, if the state is a pyramid,
Yeah.
and Trump basically the top of the pyramid since FDR, if we're following the Yarvin narrative, the top of the
Yeah.
pyramid has never been the top of the pyramid for 60, 70 years. There's
Yeah.
this kind of like this mid-level part of the pyramid that actually controls everything, and it's not
Right.
accountable to the bottom, which is the people. So
Right.
if you rejigger that middle or that upper crust enough, like the lower part of that upper crust will fall in line. That's the theory or
Yeah.
that the
Yeah, I think
certainty?
that's the theory, right? Like at the end of the day, bureaucrats have a variety of incentives, but they've got pretty cushy jobs. Most of them would like to
Yeah.
keep those jobs. And for most, I mean, there's definitely the ones you need to get rid of are the ones for whom their ideological hatred of you, and their desire, therefore, to thwart you, which again, I want to stress, this isn't some weird coup. That is a dereliction of their duties, for them to be attempting to thwart you as the duly elected administration. To the extent that you have folks like that, those are the guys you have to get rid of. But there's a lot of other guys there in the middle who maybe they don't love you, but if you show like, hey, we're going to treat you reasonably, and if you actually do your job that we want you to do, we'll also, there's promotions, there's all these other things that bureaucrats respond to incentives like everybody else, then, we'll work with those guys.
Yeah. So
So
from an
that's, I think,
insider's point of view, that's probably the tact. They're not going to gut and drain the swamp and just completely destroy the administrative state. It is more of a desire to reform it
yeah, I mean, I'd
and
say
make
it's
it in
probably a
line with the
little more aggressive
Constitution.
than just reform, but and I'd love to do some structural things. And again, this would kind of get beyond my
Hmm.
expertise to talk about how, but I'd love to just kind of in general, you want to make it easier to hire and fire and to move and not to have all these millions of policies and have everything wait for years. So there's before you can implement it. So I think there's a lot of things that you could do. But basically, I don't think this has to involve the wholesale changing out of the entire bureaucracy. It means removing the truly bad actors from the bureaucracy and changing the incentive structure for the rest of the folks.
Hmm. So you brought up the cathedral. The cathedral is this theory that I guess, high-level academia and the media is in conjunction with the deep state. Those are this kind of shadowy network that's controlling or setting the tone and the direction of the government. And it's a formidable force. We see it in the way that Trump is just treated wholesale, or just like you can see every once in a while, like the Democrat talking points will be published, and then you'll see why everybody in the MSM is saying the same thing,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You
of
see that
course.
there's this revolving door
Yeah,
of direction. And that's a formidable force. It sets the tone. It basically controls how boomers see the world, and boomers still have a lot of
sure,
power in this world.
sure.
There has been kind of rumbles of the tech bros, the billionaires, kind of going in
Yeah,
the direction of Trump. What do you think about that? Is it possible to kind of reform the cathedral, or
yeah,
to bring it in line with something that's it's
yeah.
more closely akin to your ideology?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wrote a piece a few years ago that got some attention called Towards a Republican Counter Elite in the American Conservative that
Yeah.
was very much about this type of idea. And I am a believer that you can't have de-Baathification, which is what we did in Iraq, where we basically said we came in there, and if you were associated with the ruling party at all, like that was it. Like you're out of the government. And the result of that is we didn't actually have any competent people to run the government because we didn't make any distinctions between the guys who were the true bad actors and true believers versus guys who were just kind of there because that was like the regime. So to me, like we're never going to get a majority of those guys because if we did, we fundamentally change what we're about and our goals. And in my view, a negative way, you kind of become the
Hmm.
party of the oligarchy. But we do need 10 or 20% of them. You can make up your number, whatever it is. You
Hmm.
need to figure out a way that to create an incentive structure so that, and this is not just like government officials, but it's like, and I think this is the kind of the key for the Valley too, right? It's like, can you get enough guys to be pro-Trump that like it's okay to kind of not be political anymore in the Valley. Like that's where you really want to realistically end up is you get 10 to 20% on your side, and then you probably got, 60% or 50% or whatever it is who are just ideologically committed to the other side. But then there's like another 30% there who just don't really care. And now they perceive that it's kind of okay. They can get away with not caring. And so you can at least functionally work with them if
Hmm.
you're in office to do things. And I think that's kind of where we'll lie in. And obviously, having guys like Elon or Peter Thiel or David Sachs, I mean, that helps, but we still shouldn't kid ourselves. I mean, the Valley is still I used to live there. I mean, it's a very liberal place. And I mean, but I do think, I mean, the things that the Democrats want to do, not just discriminating against white people, but ultimately increasingly discriminating against Asian Americans and other groups, and their kind of generally kind of anti-capitalist orientation, that does put pressure on the Valley. I mean, there's a lot of tension in their coalition, and we shouldn't hesitate to, um, you know,
Exploit it.
exploit that. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, w- there, so there was an attempt on Trump's life,
Yes.
and it was just a couple weeks ago, which
Yeah.
is phenomenal how fast these things recede into history. And
Yeah.
now it's being investigated, and it's kind of showing like, wait,
Yeah.
what really happened? Do you think that we'll know the truth? And what do you think that truth might likely be?
Yeah. So here's where I may disappoint maybe some of the more enthusiastic viewers. I mean, I'm a very anti-conspiratorial person, perhaps by nature, for a variety of reasons. And
Hmm.
to me, I feel strongly there is no real conspiracy theory. Like, well, okay, let me give the most conspiratorial I think you can possibly be. Were people maybe less incentivized because Trump was out of power and maybe they didn't love him to not put their very bestie best guys there? Sure. Okay, they did. The notion that the Secret Service, which again, think about their incentives, right? Like it actually is not good for them career-wise or otherwise if the president is killed on their watch, certainly for the agents on the ground, right? Like that's not what you want on your resume. So the notion that they kind of were intentionally going after Trump in some way, even though this has been pushed by some people I really respect who are not crazy people, but I don't put any credence to it. What is almost more concerning, because if it were just bad actors, you just get rid of them. What we have is even worse. It is massive institutional incompetence in these institutions. And you've got the Secret Service director, with her DEI, 30% female agents. And there's just, you could do this for other things, but in terms of the president's body protection, 100% of those guys should be men. It's just like there's no way that you get, I mean, there's a certain physical ability that you want to have to do that, right? And the notion that at the top level that that's not going to be all men is just ludicrous, right? And so you've got all this stuff, you've got this incompetence, you've got laziness, you've got CMA, you've got the fact they spotted this shooter, nobody's doing anything about it, but that's not a conspiracy, right? It's just
Hmm. Yeah.
it's rank incompetence, and rank incompetence can sometimes look conspiratorial. Um, to me, it's actually worse. So maybe that's the way I look at it.
Well, I mean, how is that an object lesson to drive point the home that there needs to be institutional reform, right? The
Right. Well,
FBI, the CIA, who's accountable for this? Will they be
right.
held accountable? Is there the political will? Can this be used to
Yeah.
kind of drive the point home that you're saying is what's needed in
Well, it's
government?
interesting that the Democrats even got on this, and I think there are probably a variety of reasons, but one of which is that I think they also recognized that this was rank incompetence, and they actually politicians would like their security to be good, right? Like they actually value that for their own selfish Machiavellian reasons. And so that's why this woman was shown the door. I think we can use it. I mean, certainly we can use it as a foot in the door against DEI.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, so we should talk about it, and I think things will come out. But I think yeah, I mean, it could be useful, but it's going to be a long struggle to get there because all of the incentives within government are just kind of broken, and we don't
Hmm.
we don't punish failure or reward success. I mean, I still think nobody who was doing security on the ground has been fired. That's actually more egregious to me than the fact, like, yeah, fine, the director has to go. I mean, that's just good leadership that, like, even fine, if he or she shouldn't have been, like, if they weren't really directly responsible, you as the leader have to take responsibility. But the people who are doing the on the ground security, I mean, they should all be shown the door. And it still hasn't happened. It's staggering that it
Yeah.
hasn't happened.
Which tells us what?
It just tells us that the
Nobody
government
cares?
has no accountability at all.
Yeah.
It's just like it doesn't matter what you do. It's just all the government exists to support and enrich itself and to give itself, sinecures and things like that.
Hmm. Do you have any thoughts on like the economic direction of the country? I know this is almost an impossible
Yeah.
answer to give, but under a Trump versus a
Yeah.
Harris administration,
Well, no, this is maybe a much more black pilled answer. I mean, short term, who knows? If I knew, I wouldn't be talking to you. I'd
he'd
be
be
playing the
making
fucking
money.
I mean, that's what you should always say to anybody who says they're going to tell you like the short term. But I'd say over the long term, we're 30 plus trillion in debt. Our interest on the debt is, already taking up a huge percentage of our taxes. Like the system is just not going to continue to exist like this. Now, I don't know when things kind of fall off the rails or what that looks like, but we're going to have some major, major disruption in the system in the next, 3 to 15 years. I don't know, at what point it happens. And to me, that is, I mean, obviously, again, will Trump be better? Of course, he'll be better. He understands
How?
business. He'll do less stupid, he'll do less stupid things with tax policy. He'll do less stupid financial giveaways to left-wing constituencies. He'll close the
Less
border
wars?
because all the what?
He'd
Uh,
fund Ukraine a little bit less, you think?
he defend Ukraine less. He's gonna, these illegal immigrants who are net tax liabilities. He'll keep more of them out. I mean, in every single respect, it will be less. And by the way, I mean, I think also as he showed by not getting in any wars at all in his first term, I think he's less likely, precisely because of his strength and his unpredictability, to get us involved in a shooting war elsewhere. Um, so I think there's lots of ways, but I think all of that is at the end of the day meaningful but marginal. It doesn't solve the structural problems around Social Security and Medicare and debt payments. And, the piper is going to need to be paid on that sooner rather than later.
How do you suppose that gets paid?
Well, it's, either you're going to collapse the system entirely, which I don't think anybody wants, or you're going to have a combination of benefit cuts and tax increases. There's no other way to
Yeah.
do it. You've got to make the books balance at least more or less. I mean, in reality, a lot of our debt holders are probably going to be left holding the bag to a degree, and they're going to have to be comfortable with that because letting the U.S. system collapse is not in the interest of the existing debt holders either, right? It's just like when you're borrowing from a bank, you want to owe them a lot of money, not a little money. Um,
Hmm.
so I think, we'll find some ways. I could see if we debureaucratized our healthcare system, we could save a tremendous amount of money there. I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount that we could save on the healthcare side. I say that as somebody who's married to a physician. I mean, it's
Hmm.
just like if you stopped having legal CMA like dominate everything and you just focused on service delivery, you could cut out so many jobs and so much expense that's related to that's not related to direct patient care. So my guess, those are hopefully, rather than actually just not treat people, that's the sort of stuff that starts getting squeezed when we have a real financial crisis on our hands.
Hmm. Hmm. And what about messaging towards women and minorities from the Trump administration? Do you think that there are things that they should be leaning into, and are they doing it correctly or incorrectly, or should they
Yeah.
just leave the identity politics stuff out to
Well,
let
I
them?
think all politics in some ways is identity politics. So I'm
Yeah.
not a person who says like, oh, you can't do that. Um, I didn't love the way that the Trump administration sometimes did this in the first term with the platinum plan and whatnot. I mean, there's a certain boomery sense. It's ironic because he's called this big racist, but Trump kind of chases the mythical black vote, black GOP vote, just like
Hmm.
every subsequent previous Republican. Certainly I think some of the ways that you talk about things can either repel or attract female voters, and we should obviously try to attract them where we can. I do think that um, Trump has put together increasingly this multiracial working class coalition, middle class coalition
Hmm.
against the sort of high-low coalition of the Dems, and I think that's a good thing overall. It's good. It's a good coalition for the country. I mean, I say that as somebody who's writing all the time about anti-whiteness, but at the same time,
Yeah.
I'm not encouraging us to be at each other's throats on the basis of race. So to the extent that we can bring more people
Common
into
ground.
the Republican coalition from different ethnic backgrounds, that's a fundamentally patriotic, pro-American coalition. I think that's a good thing, and we should continue to do it. And
Hmm.
I would expect that Trump will take his highest ever numbers among blacks, among Hispanics, and among Asian Americans. Um,
Why do you think that is?
I just
What's the
think that's
core?
I mean, that's the valence, that's the direction, particularly among Hispanics. You're really seeing that. And
Yeah.
again, I don't say that. I mean, there's a little bit too much of pixie dust and overly hopeful thinking about how
Yeah.
Hispanic the GOP will be, or how much we can attract Hispanics. But I do think that we could easily see Trump getting into like the 40 plus numbers that George W. Bush ran among Hispanics.
Hmm.
I think that's very possible.
Hmm. So the this is political rhetoric, and it's odd because the Dems or the left is always projecting. They project onto the Republican Party that they want a Handmaid's Tale while they're fully supporting surrogacy for gay men to rent women's wombs. So they're actually
Yeah.
performing that. But I'm just wondering, like message wise, or from your own personal point of view, I haven't heard you really speak about this, but what is the likelihood of the like a more conservative turn in politics will impact negatively women's rights or women's liberties or something like that. Is
Yeah, well,
that
so this is maybe an area where I will, again, I don't know your audience fully, but I'm much more traditionalist. So, I mean, to
yeah.
me, I would kind of reject the entire women's rights framing because I don't think that feminism has helped the vast majority of women. I think it's always been a project of a certain group of elite women who have not been happier in more traditional roles that the vast majority of women actually sort of prefer to be in. So I would love to see more patriarchy, not because I want to lord over women in some way, but because I actually think that that is a traditional, healthy, and happy way that societies have always organized themselves in general. And that doesn't mean that you're inflexible. I mean, again, I'm married to a very empowered physician who's also the mother of five children.
Wow.
So it's not that you're doing this to um, oppress women in some way, but that as many women on the right have pointed out, I mean, sort of girl boss culture is actually not good for women. The radical egalitarianism that we've had makes women really unhappy because most women are not looking for an egalitarian relationship with a man. They're looking for a man that in some ways they can look up to and who will provide for them. Even the ones who like really bitterly protest this nominally, like, and
Hmm.
again, the problem is that we've had feminism that has been run by a minority of women who actually genuinely, in many cases, don't want that. But they tend, like that girl boss culture, that like super independent women, the late childbearing, the whole bit, like that doesn't actually represent the desires that most women have for their lives. So I would love to see a more traditional ordering of society. And I think certainly
Hmm.
you're seeing this on the right to a degree. I mean, you're seeing more people returning to these norms and realizing that the things that we are setting are inimical to family formation and human flourishing. And so that we need to maybe go back to things that had worked before rather than what's not working now.
Yeah, but policy-wise, would you prefer less government involvement? Is this at all a policy
I think
issue?
you can know you actually have to have government moving because this is, my friend Oren McIntyre talks about this a lot. There's a sort of myth of the neutral state, right? Like the state currently subsidizes in a million different ways feminism of various radical types. So you actually want to encourage the state to subsidize traditional families, traditional structures. I mean, I always laugh at this because it's like one of the most obvious things. The Democrats' obsession with paying for daycare, right? Which is A, just like inefficient, but B, just automatically assumes that, women are racing out once they have a kid and they would, like, the thing they would most like to do is to put their child in daycare. Now, again, for some women, I'm not trying to be like, Joe, whatever here. Like that's what they actually want. Okay. Especially maybe at the top of the heap, but most of them don't. So instead, like, why not just give whatever amount you're spending on that daycare subsidy, just give it to women, right? Give it to families when they have kids and
Hmm.
let them decide how they're going to use it, whether they want to use it for daycare. Like it's just that is a conservative solution that is a dominant solution, right? It's just a better solution, period. And
Hmm.
yet we have conservatives, or at least some of them, or Republicans, competing about subsidized daycare with Democrats. It's nuts. I mean, that should be
Hmm.
not something that we should be doing at all. So I think there are lots of things that we could do in terms of the state. You look at what country like Hungary has done to promote child rearing and childbearing and families. And it's not a perfect solution because ultimately the values of society have
Yeah.
but certainly you could make it. I mean, the stated goal in Hungary, which I think would be a great stated goal for America, is that having a child should not leave you financially worse off than an equivalent income person. So you structure your tax system, and of course, JD Vance kind of was indirectly suggesting this. You structure your tax system so that, like, my net expenditures as a parent of three kids or whatever
Hmm.
are, the same as if I were single and didn't have those three kids. And that way, that's the sort of thing where it's like, uh, the only thing you have to think about is, do I want the kids, not like the financial burden that the kids are going to be.
Hmm. Hmm.
So.
So this, you brought up the cycle just going so fast, so fast. What is the key thing for you that you focus on, or that you think is the most important thing to keep at the top of the heap,
Policy
politically,
wise,
policy,
or
yeah, policy wise, or like what do you have your sights on? What are you trained on?
well, I'm the administrative state stuff we talked about. I think we need fundamental structural reform,
Yep.
institutional reform. These are the most important things, is reforming the structures. Um, Second would be immigration because it's like that's who the American people are going to be. Um, if we can't control who we're letting in as part of our American family, we're not going to succeed. And then, I'd love to just, if I ever went into the administration, just to like kind of go in and take out every DEI or
Hmm.
anti-white policy, which there's huge numbers of them, and just get rid of them. Those would be my policy priorities for any
Hmm.
administration.
Hmm. And where can people find you, and what will they see when they find you?
Yeah, so well, you can go to my Substack. Actually, I'll promote that first, which is I'm actually about to change it to thecourseofempire.org, but it's
Hmm.
carl.substack.com currently. The Course of Empire, I publish there regularly. I'm also published regularly at the American Mind and American Greatness and American Conservative and all those places. But in almost all cases, if you go to my Twitter feed or X feed, if you will, real Jeremy Carl, that's where I'm posting pretty regularly. And I have a pretty decent number of followers there. And then, of course, I have to throw in a plug for my new book, which is, we mentioned earlier, I mean, it's done quite well, which is called The Unprotected Class, and it's on the rise of anti-white racism and discrimination in the US, and five-star Amazon reviews, average, and lots of professional reviewers have liked it as
Hmm.
well. So I would definitely encourage folks who are interested in those issues to check that out.
Hmm. How optimistic are you about America at this point in time?
Um, I may be in the long term, I'm kind of short the United States, but long America.
Hmm.
Um, So by that I mean, I don't know that our existing institutional relationships are going to be that durable. I wish I felt otherwise. It's not that I'm not a happy accelerationist. I just am trying to be realistic about what I'm seeing out there. But I do think that there's still a tremendous amount of human capital and social capital and other things in the American people that is a lot better than the way that we've been governed. And I'm optimistic that in some form or fashion, on some hopefully large, if not complete portion of the American homeland, that we will be able to, over the long term, reorganize in a way that we can be governed in a way that is
Hmm.
kind of consistent with the value and virtue of the American people.
And how do you, what's the most important thing for people in their daily lives to do in order to achieve that?
Yeah, well, I
What do you
mean, for
think?
me, I can only speak, right? Like, I'm very involved in my church community. I mean, I understand if you're not a believer, then that's maybe not an option. But I think, finding a good social community that you can be involved with in a very local way is really important. Having real friends, not just internet friends. Just developing those deep and thick social connections, because believe me, if the state starts to wobble a little bit, those are the connections that you're going to want to
Hmm.
lean on. And the people who are just in various ways very dependent on high levels of state function may have a interesting time, unfortunately, in the coming decades in America. And so it's really doing that. And for me, it's been ideologically trying to find people of a similar mindset throughout the country, and so that when maybe if things get interesting and there are new opportunities, we sort of know where each other are, and can begin to work together.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your mid morning slash early afternoon, Jeremy Carl. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and I'll
Absolutely. Pleasure
link
talking
to
with you.
all your work down in the description.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Benjamin.
All right. Cheers.
Yep.